Hi friends, today we will discuss a really creepy case. So there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, but when she was bad, she was horrid. Today we're gonna be talking about the notorious killer, a 10-year-old girl named Mary Bell. Pain and death were her companions almost from the moment of her birth. Mary Bell was born on May 26, 1957, to Betty, a 16-year-old prostitute who repeatedly told doctors to take that thing away from me when she saw her daughter. Things went downhill from there. Mary's childhood was a recipe for disaster. She grew up in a slum area of Scotswood marked by abandoned buildings, petty crime, and domestic violence. Children were left to play unsupervised for hours in the streets. Her mother Betty was a prostitute who traveled to Glasgow to work, often leaving Mary behind for days at a time. It's not known who Mary's biological father was, but for most of her life she believed it to be Billy Bell, a habitual criminal who married Betty after Mary was born. To say that Betty was unfit to be a mother is an understatement. Independent family members stated that Betty had more than once attempted to kill Mary and make her death look accidentally during the first few years of her life. Her family was suspicious when Mary fell from a window and when she accidentally consumed sleeping pills. On one such occasion, a witness saw Betty giving the pills to her daughter as sweets. When Mary was an infant, she gave her to child service to adopt her out to another family. Unfortunately for Mary, her aunts retrieved her before this could happen. They offered to raise Mary for Betty, but she refused. Mary was subject to repeated sexual abuse, her mother forcing her from the age of 4 to engage in sex acts with men. Mary was also subjected to physical abuse. In book about Mary called Cries Unheard, the story of Mary Bell, author Gita Sarini talks about how, as a child, Betty would force her daughter to take part in prostitution. Other family members would tell her that in the early years of her life, Betty would try to kill Mary, trying to make it look like an accident. There are suspicions that Betty suffered from the psychiatric disease Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where caregivers fabricate health problems of those in their care, in this case, her young daughter Mary. By the time she reached adolescence, Mary was an extremely angry, dangerous child who often tried to asphyxiate other children.
I was in the same class as Mary, and that's when I used to play with her. The first thing that comes into your mind about Mary is her eyes. She's got very, very distinctive blue eyes, very attractive blue eyes, I suppose, but they are very distinctive and they can fix you with a stare.
She had such a heavy dark fringe in the blue eyes, the piercing eyes. She would stay, and it's just like got fixed on you, you knew you were in for trouble.
She could be sort of fine, playing away 1 minute, doing the things normal kids do, and then she'd maybe get something that kid might upset her, and that's when the change would start, and she could become quite aggressive.
From 9-year-old, where I can remember, I was frightened of her. So what you did was you kept away from her. But the situations where she would come to you, or who you were playing with, so you just had to watch. You had to be very, very careful of her. You wouldn't have turned your back on her.
On 2 separate occasions, Mary attempted to murder other children. She was accused of trying to suffocate a little girl whose parents called police to investigate. For whatever reasons, charges weren't filed and the incident was overlooked. On another occasion, she beat and burned a boy at school with a cigarette. He reported this to their teacher, who asked Mary if it was true, and calmly Mary replied yes. Again, for unknown reasons, Mary wasn't called upon to explain her actions by authorities. Not surprisingly, Mary was feared by all children on her school playground. If a child in any way annoyed her, she fixed that child with an evil stare that indicated she intended to harm the child as terribly and as soon as she could, which she usually did. One little girl remembered Mary strangling her and stuffing sand into her mouth to the point where she was certain she was going to die. At the time, very few children reported these incidents to parents or teachers.
I met Mary when a child in my class came in one morning and had a mark on her cheek. When I asked her what it was, she said that Mary had stubbed out a cigarette on her cheek. And when I sent for Mary, along came this little girl, and I said to her, "Have you done this?" And Mary said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, I'm just sorry for what you've done." Yeah.
During that era, children simply accepted bullying as a way of life. It may have been significant that Mary attempted asphyxiation on several children and attempted strangulation. It's possible that the child's actions reflected her own abuse by Betty and her customers, whom she often brought home. Although Mary's violent behavior is noticed by those around her, nothing is done and she carries on unchecked with terrible consequences. For weeks before her first murder, Mary Bell had been acting strangely. On May 11, 1968, Mary had been playing with a 3-year-old boy when he was badly injured in a fall from the top of an air raid shelter. His parents thought it was an accident. The following day, however, 3 mothers came forward to tell police that Mary had attempted to choke their young daughters. A brief police interview and a lecture resulted, but no charges were filed. Then on May 25th, the day before she turned 11, Mary Bell strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown to death in an abandoned house in Scotswood, England. She left the scene and returned with a friend, Norma Bell. The last name is the same for both the girls, but they had no relation, to find they'd been beaten there by 2 local boys who had been playing in the house and stumbled on the body. Police were mystified. Besides a little blood and saliva on the victim's face, there were no obvious signs of violence. There was, however, an empty bottle of painkillers on the floor near the body. In the absence of better information, they assumed that Martin just had swallowed the pills. His death was ruled an accident, but Martin's grieving family might have started to suspect otherwise when little Mary Bell showed up on their doorstep in the days after Martin's death and asked to see him. His mother gently explained to her that Martin was dead, but Mary said she already knew that and that she wanted to see his body in the coffin. Martin's mother slammed the door in her face, and shortly after, Mary and her friend Norma broke into a nursery school and vandalized it with notes taking responsibility for Martin's death and promising to kill again. Police assumed the notes were a prank. So for the nursery school, this was just the latest and most disturbing in a series of breaks-ins. They rarely installed an alarm system, and it was a smart choice because it caught Mary and Norma at the scene of the crime several nights later. But they were simply loitering outside when the police arrived. They were let off the hook. In the meantime, Mary was telling her fellow classmates that she had killed Martin Brown. Her reputation as a show-off and a liar prevented anyone from taking her claims seriously. That is until another young boy turned up dead. On July 31st, 2 months after the first murder, Mary Bell and her friend Norma killed 3-year-old Brian Hove by strangulation. This time, the murder was more brutal and nasty. She not only strangulated the child, but also cut his hair with scissors, wounded his sides, and mutilated his genitals with a blade. They left his body and went away. Later on, they returned to the place and carved the first letters of their names on the belly of the victim. Initially, it was believed that Norma carved N, that was later on amended by Mary from N to M. When Brian's sister went looking for him, Mary and Norma offered to help. They searched the neighborhood, and Mary even pointed out to the concrete blocks that hid his body. But Norma said he wouldn't be there, and Brian's sisters moved on. When Brian's body was finally found, the neighborhood was panicked. 2 boys were dead in as many months. The police collected the initial information about the area and possible criminals, and the suspect could be anyone. During the process, they focused more on the children in the area and questioned them about the recent murder cases. Of all the children, 2 girls, Norma and Mary Bell, appeared to act strangely. Police received a shock when the coroner's report came back. As Brian's blood had cooled, new marks appeared on his chest. Someone had used a razor blade to scratch the letter M. And there was another disturbing note. The lack of force used in the attack suggested Brian's killer might have been a child. Mary and Norma did a poor job of disguising their interest in the investigation in their interviews with police. Both acted strangely. Norma was excited and Mary evasive, especially when police pointed out that she had been seen with Brian on the day of his death. When Norma was questioned about the murder, she was smiling and expressed her excitement at the murder story. The detective noticed that Norma isn't reacting to the questions naturally and is trying to feign something else as she took the story as a joke. On the other hand, Mary Bell also tried to be evasive and reacted strangely to the questions asked of her. She even went on to add more stories to it that confirmed the suspicions of the police. During the investigation, at one point she said that she had seen the victim playing with another 8-year-old boy in the area where the accident happened. At another point, she claimed that the 8-year-old boy was having seizures. The police inquired about it and found that on the day of Brian's murder, the boy who was blamed by Mary visited the airport. During the investigation, the police didn't share the information about seizures, but Mary Bell mentioned it in her stories that implicated her. The police readily understood that Mary knew about the murder, but they waited a bit longer to confirm it. During Brian's funeral, a police detective was observing Mary Bell's behavior. The detective found strange things. When they brought out Brian's coffin, she was standing outside his house, smiling and rubbing her hands. That showed disgust and excitement. This led to the urgency of avoiding any future mishap. The police reinvestigated Norma, Mary's friend, immediately. This time, the revelations were shocking. Norma began cooperating with police and implicated Mary, who herself admitted to being present during Brian Hove's murder but tried to place the blame on Norma. Both girls were charged and a trial date was set. This is what Norma told the police. When Norma was investigated again, she disclosed the secrets of Mary and informed them of how the murder was committed. According to Norma, Mary took her to the abandoned house to show her Brian's body. There, she told her how she squeezed Brian's neck and how she enjoyed it. When the police arrested Mary, she said that Norma was lying and making trouble for her. Her evasiveness made it difficult to fully confirm the murder, as she blamed Norma for the murders. Nonetheless, the police arrested them both and put them on trial. During the trial, the police searched for more information and found additional evidence. Accordingly, other children also overheard her that day screaming and pointing to the house while saying that I'm a murderer and that's where I killed. During her confinement before trial, she was also overheard by female guards saying strange things such as I like hurting little things that can't fight back. Earlier, she wasn't taken seriously, but owing to her weird behavior, psychiatrists labeled her as psychopathic. At trial, the prosecutor told the court that Bell's reason for committing the murders was solely for the pleasure and excitement of killing. Meanwhile, the British press referred to her as evil born. The jury agreed that Mary Bell had committed the murders and handed down a guilty verdict in December. Manslaughter, not murder, was the conviction, as court psychiatrists had convinced the jury that Mary Bell showed classic symptoms of psychopathy and couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. Norma Bell was regarded as an unwilling accomplice who had fallen under a bad influence. She was acquitted. The judge concluded that Mary was a dangerous person and a serious threat to other children. She was sentenced to be imprisoned at Her Majesty's pleasure, a British legal term that denotes an indeterminate sentence, basically until the powers that be feel like it's appropriate to let you out. After her conviction, Mary was the focus of attention from the British press. Her mother told stories about her.
Betty Bell herself gave a television interview in 1972, 4 years after the killings. She was by then a broken woman, relying on drink and drugs for peace of mind.
Now, Betty, are you saying that your daughter is innocent?
No, I'm not saying she's innocent.
But something must have made her do these things.
Yes, something possibly must have made her do these things.
And what was it about her life and her family you think that could have driven her to these things?
Maybe it's the arguments between my husband and myself might have had some inflict on her. I don't know.
Have you been very despairing sometimes? And
Very despairing, very under a lot of strain, stress, and grief for my daughter.
When she visited Mary in prison during the trial, she pinched her child and tormented her verbally. Throughout her childhood and her teens, Mary refused to take responsibility for her crimes. While imprisoned, Mary wrote her mother a long letter in which she stated that although she murdered 2 children and was convicted of other crimes, her mother's abuse had driven her to it. It was you, Mom, it was always you. Apparently, the powers that be were impressed with Bell's treatment and rehabilitation and felt like it was appropriate to let Mary out in 1980. She was released on license, which meant that she was technically still serving her sentence, but was able to do so while living in the community under strict probation. Additionally, Mary was given a new identity to provide her with a chance at a new life and protect her from tabloid attention. Even still, she was forced to move several times to escape hounding by tabloids, newspapers, and the general public, which somehow always found ways of tracking her down. Things grew worse for Belle after she had her daughter in 1984. Belle's daughter didn't know about her mother's crimes until she was 14, when a tabloid paper was able to find Belle's common-law husband and thus tracks Belle down. Soon, a slew of journalists surrounded her house and camped out in front of it. The family had to escape their home with bed sheets over their heads. Today, Belle is in protective custody at a secret address. Both she and her daughter remain anonymous and are protected under court order. Some feel she doesn't deserve the protection. June Richardson, the mother of Martin Brown, told the media it's all about her and now she has to be protected. As victims, we aren't given the same rights as killers. Nevertheless, Mary Bell remains protected by the British government today, and court ruling protecting the identities of 13 convicts are even unofficially referred to as Mary Bell orders. Mary's daughter's anonymity was protected only until she reached the age of 18. However, in May 2003, Mary won a high court battle to have her own anonymity and that of her daughter extended for life. Mary never reopened and lives a quiet, law-abiding life. Astonishingly, Mary brought her child to visit her grandmother, Betty. Mary was astonished by the loving interaction between Betty and her granddaughter, particularly when the little girl amused Betty, who laughed out loud. In 2009, it was reported that Mary had become a grandmother. When we came to know that she killed innocents at quite the young age of 11, our minds asked questions as to why she chose that way. What led her to commit such grave crimes without remorse? Extreme physical and mental trauma and the nightmarish from her childhood experiences may account for her strange behavior. Another event that is said to have augmented her miseries and made her life more tragic is that she watched her 5-year-old friend overrun by a bus. So, the occasional sexual abuse by her mother's client, loneliness, lack of friends, a best friend's horrible death, coupled with the genetic problems, have made her a psychopath. Mary Bell was horribly abused, her mind wasn't fully developed at the young age, and she didn't know any other way to express her rage. The whole thing is a tragedy. Can we say that her mother is the one who should have been made to pay for Mary Bell's crimes? Write what do you think about this case, and thank you so much for watching this episode. See you the next time. Bye. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye.